Alright boys and girls, thank you for joining me once again where people continue to be wrong on the interwebs. Here is a little video put together by a channel called Coach Perry, all about running apparently. And this is a little video entitled The Worst Running Advice Ever. The worst ever! And what you should do instead. So let's see whether Coach Perry indeed do understand what is good advice and not good advice for runners. I haven't watched this through, that's the caveat. This is my first time watching through this video. I suspect, unfortunately, that Coach Perry have no idea whatever what they're talking about. So we're about to find out whether I'm correct or not. Let's go, Coach Perry.
Today we're going to be talking to you about the worst running advice you've ever received in the world. We've all been in running clubs or in environments where you hear people giving someone advice and you think, gosh, that can't be right. You know, should you walk in a run? Should you smash every single run? Or should you go out and run 50 Ks in the middle of the week or, you know, bank time in a race? And you think, no man, no, that can't be right. So I'm Dieter Letzeker from CoachPerry.com and let's dive straight in and I'll hand you over to Devin.
You're standing around after a club run, sitting at a coffee shop. One of those pieces of advice that fly around often is in order to run fast, you need to practice running fast, meaning...
Correct. Physiologically, that is absolutely a correct statement. All training is specific. Ideally, and that means in terms of modality. So if you're a runner, the way to train for running is to run and not to ride a bicycle or to row, for example. And also the specific intensity at which you wish to perform is the intensity at which you should train or above. And there are very good physiological reasons for all of those statements. But I suspect that given that in his very first statement, he's alluding to his next statement where he's going to say that it's not correct, that you should train at high intensity to perform at high intensity. And he's going to get it completely, utterly wrong. Off you go though.
Every run you do needs to be fast. That is not the case.
Yes, it is.
So one thing here at Coach Perry we really try and drive home is getting your easy runs run easy enough. Reason being, so I'm going to dive into just a little bit of physiology around it.
Yeah, but you're going to get it completely wrong because if you knew anything about physiology, you'd know that running well below competitive intensity for periods of time vastly exceeding the competitive distance over which you want to run is absolutely physiologically contraindicated. Let's go.
To keep things pretty simple, your body functions in two predominant metabolic zones. One being...
No, it doesn't. It's a continuum. There are no zones in the continuum. A continuum is something that slides from one end to the other, actually. So no, wrong.
An aerobic metabolism and the other being an anaerobic metabolism.
Okay, this is a clown that knows absolutely nothing whatever about exercise physiology. Nothing at all. All exercise is aerobic at all times in human beings without there being oxygen capacitated within the muscle by myoglobin and being constantly used by the mitochondria in order to produce the energy required that needs to be translated to the sliding filament contractile machinery. A muscle cell will immediately, within one or two muscle twitches, will undergo irreversible tetanus, and that person will die within 4.5 minutes if oxygen is removed from the situation. Human beings are absolutely, completely dependent upon oxygen at all times and all exercise intensities, from complete rest right through to volitional exercise exhaustion at the high end of such a ramp volitional exhaustion exercise physiology test. Okay, no, there are not two zones in human physiology, one being aerobic and one being anaerobic. Our ability to produce energy for muscular contraction anaerobically is basically none whatsoever. So we could really stop this video right here and stop listening any further to these people. They are obviously completely and utterly ignorant about exercise physiology and not a good source of information. But anyway, let's hear some more fallacies and we'll put those right specifically as well.
Anaerobic being the lack of oxygen, so
Never happens, ever, during exercise. What an absolutely ridiculous statement to make. The moment you remove oxygen, the lack of oxygen, that starts the process of you dying. And you will die within 4.5 minutes if oxygen is not reintroduced. It only takes 4.5 minutes, by the way, because that's how long it takes your tissue to irreversibly become so damaged by the lack of oxygen that it cannot be revived. Okay? Sometimes longer if, in examples of people that fall into very cold water or that sort of thing, sure, absolutely. But you remove oxygen, death. Okay? Stop talking nonsense. What's next?
in the absence of oxygen, this
Never happens. I've said that.
is where we really start working at a higher intensity and in
Rubbish. Absolute rubbish. The higher you work in exercise intensity, the higher your oxygen consumption up to your individual biological maximum. It's called the VO2 max. At no point does your oxygen consumption drop below the resting level to a zero level, to the absence of oxygen uptake. Absolute rubbish.
In order to deliver energy to the muscles, our body burns or requires carbohydrates.
Okay, your body requires carbohydrates to produce muscular contraction at all times and at all exercise intensities, from complete rest right up to volitional exhaustive exercise. There is no way to contract a muscle fiber whatsoever without using carbohydrates to do so, and it doesn't burn them in order to achieve that. So once again, this is someone who knows absolutely nothing about exercise physiology, even at its most basic fundamental tenets. This is absolutely ridiculous that this person, whoever you are, thinks himself qualified to talk to people about exercise physiology. Son, no. This is a joke. All right? Knock it off.
The other is the aerobic metabolism. Now,
You don't have a choice. You have one and only one metabolic system, and it does rely entirely upon oxygen at all times. Goodness me. Here's what happens. The sliding filaments are powered by glycogenolysis and nothing else. And only glycogenolysis, in other words. The energy to resynthesize glycogen from incoming blood glucose between muscular twitches in a given fiber is subserved by the transfer of that energy to those actin-myosin associated ATPases via phosphocreatine. That phosphocreatine, having been supplied with its potential energy by being coupled at the outer membrane of the mitochondria to their internal activities, and those internal activities are supplied in terms of fuel by both carbohydrate and fat oxidation, mostly. Very, very simple. They're all gears in a gearbox. They are not individual energy systems. You cannot choose between them. You cannot do without any one of them. This is just going to be yet another example of ridiculous reductionism from people who do not understand how the body works, who want to tell you how the body works. It's ridiculous. Knock it on the head, son.
aerobic metabolism is in the presence of oxygen.
All metabolism occurs in the presence of oxygen, clown. All of it. You remove oxygen, that person will die very, very quickly. What is next?
Ideally, as a runner, building a good aerobic base means we are that much more efficient in our body providing energy for the task at hand to our muscles and organs around the body as needed. Now,
And the way to train your body for a specific intensity of running is to run at that intensity or above for the period of time that you need to endure running at the competitive intensity you would want or desire, or shorter if your intensity of training is above that at which you want to compete. Straightforward. At no time ever should you train below that intensity. That is not even training. That is actually antagonistic to training for reasons that I'll cover in a bit. What is next?
Now, by running our easy runs easy enough, it means we do improve our aerobic metabolism.
Nonsense. Absolute rubbish. Or not any more effectively than running at an intensity that you wish to compete at or above. All you are talking about here, Sunshine, is imposing a whole bunch of contraindicated training load and cumulative fatigue on a person that is totally unnecessary and will break down their body eventually, will shorten their career as an athlete, absolutely, will probably lead them to an unhealthy cardiovascular situation later in life, actually, and is completely at odds with the biological design of human beings as per our genetic gift and our evolutionary process. Sunshine. This is absolutely, utterly ridiculous. Crazy.
If we're training too hard and we're trying to push every run fast, we're working too close to that anaerobic threshold.
There is no anaerobic threshold. It does not exist. At the point of volitional exhaustion, your oxygen uptake is maximized. Anaerobic means in the absence of oxygen. That never occurs. We're done here. What is next?
And by working very close to that anaerobic threshold, one, puts a lot of demand on our muscles, which means we...
Goodness me, you wouldn't want to place demand on your muscles, would you? The very thing that you want to place demand on in your competitive event, such as to make them used to the specific stimulus in terms of exercise intensity upon them, which you are going to ask of them on the day. Goodness! Does that make sense?
We take a little bit longer to recover from a session like that.
That's why you should rest longer between sessions and not do so much volume. That's why you should run no more than about 3 or 4 times a week, and you should always do it at the intensity you wish to compete at or above for a period of time, lasting as long as your event or shorter. Okay? Straightforward.
But also, we tend to detrain our aerobic efficiency.
Nonsense. Absolute rubbish. There is no evidence to support that claim whatsoever existing anywhere in the physiological literature, of which I know a lot about. More than a quarter of a century as an exercise physiologist. I understand what's in there very well and what work has been done. You clearly don't. Whoever you are. I don't even know who you are, but this is just crazy.
Now, by detraining our aerobic efficiency,
it doesn't happen. So why would you go on any further? That does not occur.
When we get to a race, for example, you're going to run that race, and the first thing that happens later on when you start to kick into that level of fatigue is you drop to what we like to refer to as the lowest common denominator, meaning
you're just making up words now. You're just saying things that go on in a race when they don't. You do not decrease your aerobic efficiency by training hard. If anything, you improve it more rapidly than training well below its capacity. And actually, you also train its on kinetics, which is a very, very important factor as well in determining your critical velocity of running. Okay, what's next?
You are going to drop to where your aerobic threshold is.
There is no aerobic threshold. It does not exist. So you're just talking nonsense here.
And if we are detraining that aerobic threshold,
we are not detraining something that does not exist. Clown.
It means that sustained pace or that sustained effort or lowest common denominator is also dropping, and
only it isn't. That does not occur.
Detraining over time.
No.
On threshold, you've probably only got about 30 to 40 minutes of that kind of intensity.
There is no threshold. The amount of time over which you can endure running at any given velocity is determined by your critical velocity. Perhaps you should go and learn something about it.
So if you're pushing too hard, you're not fresh, and your aerobic system is not well enough developed.
Well, if your system is not well enough developed, It is because your training has been suboptimal. Suboptimal training is any training, so-called training, whatsoever below the competitive intensity. Totally, utterly contraindicated. You will not suffer an insufficiently trained system should you train at the intensity and for the durations that I have already adequately described. Does not happen.
It means when you do hit that wall, you drop, and it makes the rest of your race that much harder. This is a huge factor into why we say...
Yeah, the answer, though, is not to run for huge amounts of miles at an intensity vastly below the intensity at which you wish to be competitive. Your muscle fibers are physically trainable. If you ask your muscles to move, if you exercise in a modality like running at a velocity vastly below what is competitive, you are training your body to recruit motor units and muscle fibers that are at the end, closer to the low intensity end. You are also training more of your muscle fibers at the end that you need them to be at to become physically more like the others. You are actually reducing your capacity to output a given power for a given period of time. You are compromising your ability to exercise in the manner that you would like to. So you train, that is how you will also perform. Or as you train, so shall you perform is a better way of wording that. If you train long and slow, that is what will happen on race day. You will take a long time to finish and you will be slow. If you want to be faster, then train faster. Simple as that. What is next?
Do not run every run hard.
Wrong. You should run every single run hard, and you should run a lot less often than you probably do as a runner. Because everybody tells you that more is better, and when that doesn't work, because it never will, even more is even better than that. You're just not doing enough volume, they'll tell you. Absolute nonsense. Rubbish. False. What you're not doing is sufficient intensity. Okay? This is really straightforward.
It's not about training at race pace.
Yes, it absolutely is. Yes, it is. Wrong.
Doing training sessions at race pace, it's about building an efficiency to running. It's about being...
Oh my word. Efficiency of running in a given gait is also dependent upon speed of running. Efficiency is absolutely part of the specificity of training. Train yourself to be very efficient at running slower than you want to on race day, and guess what will happen on race day? You will fall naturally into a pattern and cadence of running slower than you want to. Okay? Goodness me.
Being fresh to every training.
I can see why this video is called the worst running advice ever. Because that's what we're getting here. The worst physiological training advice ever. The worst ever.
Session you get to, or rather the next training session you get to, and more importantly, it's about being fresh on the start line at race day.
Right, well, a good way to be fresh is to vastly reduce your volume and to rest and recover vastly more than most runners do. Good. Now, who's this clown? And does he have anything more sensible to say than the last bloke? Because, mate, whoever you were, that was absolutely appalling from start to finish. What's next? An ad.
Agent, you've got a great problem. New One Twist hair color by L'Oreal Men Expert.
I often get athletes telling me how good they felt in a training run and how they pushed a section or a hill or something in their run just to prove to themselves or test.
Put your hands by your sides and keep your head still when you're speaking and presenting. Very straightforward. Very simple. We need to be able to concentrate on what you are saying, which so far, son, is nothing. Okay? Get to the point.
how good their legs are. Testing yourself on each run is really not a good way to get going.
Yes, it really is, actually. Wrong again.
Each session in a week really should have its place.
Yes, i.e. every session you run ought to be training. And training, by the very definition, son, is exceeding or at least maintaining your current maximal capacity. So if you are running for a period of time that does not exhaust you, at an intensity that does not exhaust you, you are not training. That is just incidental exercise, and actually that's just cumulative fatigue that will just break you down over years, shorten your career as an athlete, and reduce your capacity to perform to your best physiological potential during any competitive running event. Straightforward.
In the week. And if you're feeling particularly good on a given day, it is all right to switch runs around occasionally and take advantage of feeling good. But the key then is that you have to adjust the rest of your week to make sure that the rest of the week is done in such a way that running hard on the day you weren't supposed to run hard on doesn't
You are supposed to run hard every single time you run. Otherwise, don't bother at all.
Compromise the training in the rest of the week. So always bear in mind that a training plan has been put together in a specific way to allow you to run hard on certain days, to make sure that you run easy on other days.
No, you should not be doing any such thing, ever.
And on an easy day, it's not a good idea to test yourself and test how good you are feeling on that particular day.
Wrong. Totally wrong. Absolute nonsense. Rubbish from start to finish. This all comes from the ideological standpoint that volume is the answer to running performance. It isn't. Volume is not the answer. Okay? It is intensity. Appropriate intensity for appropriate duration.
Rather save that for another day. And I think the biggest reason why you shouldn't be testing yourself every day is quite simply by repeatedly doing that, you're putting yourself at a very unnecessary injury risk.
Wrong. The unnecessary injury risk comes from miles and miles and miles and miles of completely inappropriate intensity, incidental exercise that's not even training for that runner. Absolute rubbish. Goodness me.
Another piece of advice that we do hear quite often is, in order to run faster and improve your running, you need to be running more and you need to be running every day.
No, both of those are false. It's not more running that's the answer. It's appropriate intensity for appropriate duration. And absolutely the last thing you should do is run every day. You should not run any more than every other day.
Again, that is not the case. Running more, so increasing the volume hugely, particularly,
or indeed at all above where it should be,
depending on if you're coming from a more of a recreational level, for example, or you're on the slower end of the running spectrum, and now suddenly you want to improve, or you want to run a marathon and you're just dumping training load, running every single day, running much more volume, you're not recovering well enough. So all that happens is you build fatigue on top of fatigue, and over a period of time you are going to find yourself digging a hole where you're just always tired, you're at a higher risk of injury, you're at a higher risk of illness. And that then means if something goes wrong, you pick up that little injury, or you do get sick, it means it puts you off of training for a period of time.
Right, so all of those are reasons to never ever run for long periods of time at an intensity below that which is competitive. Good. I cannot for the life of me understand why you would advise anything other than that. There is no physiological basis for doing miles and miles of training at an intensity well below competitively. So you've just been talking in your last segment about running easy, which you should never ever do, and now you're giving us all the reasons why what I've just said is correct and you should never ever do that. Goodness gracious me, this is ridiculous.
That you actually end up losing out on valuable training. You'll be better off running 4 times a week with getting other components, so strength training, maybe a little bit of cross training in here and there, but focusing on having some rest and recovery between those running sessions allow you to be that much more consistent over time in your training, ultimately improving.
Right, okay, so that is correct. You should train no more than 4 times a week. So if you're going to train no more than 4 times a week, surely you need to train at competitive intensity or above every single one of those sessions. That's the whole point. So what's this nonsense about running easy? That's just volume of exercise for no training benefit.
As a runner.
The new Samsung Galaxy Fold 4 and Flip 4 are here.
My favorite discussion that I have with runners, particularly at marathon and longer distance races, is when they talk to me about needing to bank time so they can save something for the second half. That is the classic definition of insanity. It's pre-deciding how you're going to be at the end of a race. Essentially, by banking time in the first half of a race relative to what your goal time is at the end means that you guarantee that you're going to have a miserable second half, you guarantee that you're going to blow up, and you guarantee that you're going to bleed time at the end. The best way to execute on your goal time is to have a relatively even strategy. It is okay and normal to have a slightly slower second half than a first half, but if you go out with the express intent of putting time in the bag, you are going to use up that time and then some. My dad taught me this at the age of 5 years old. And he said it to me a couple of times over the years, and he said to me, Lindsay, you cannot put enough time in the bag in the first half of a race to make up for the time that you'll lose in the second half of the race. And a little formula that I've managed to work out from witnessing and looking at people who do use that strategy is that in a marathon you will lose between 2 and 2.5 minutes per minute too fast that you go through halfway, and in an ultra marathon you will lose roughly 4 minutes in the second half for every minute that you go too fast in the first half of a marathon. So make sure you plan your race properly.
Probably well before we get to any of this, you should train appropriately in the first place. And that is train yourself physiologically to run at the speed that would get you to the end of the marathon in the time you want to complete the marathon, and train at that intensity for that period of time, or a higher intensity for a shorter period of time, but always to the point of volitional exhaustion, and never more than 4 times a week. And certainly you wouldn't cover the marathon distance even once a week. You would build up to the marathon distance such that you would complete a marathon in your training once and once only prior to the marathon, and you would probably do that no less than 14 days prior to the event, after which you will taper off in your training almost completely. Okay? Pretty straightforward. Goodness me. What is next?
And that you go through on a fairly even strategy.
One of the worst things you can do as a runner is to pick a running plan that's beyond your ability. So to give you some context, let's say you want to run a sub 3 hour marathon, but right now your best marathon time is like 3:50. You think if I run a 3 hour marathon pace, of course I'm going to improve. but you might be surprised to learn that it's actually not going to work out for you. The reason for this is that you're going to be changing the purpose of every single run that you're doing. So for example,
you need to slow down when you are speaking and enunciate clearly, son. We cannot understand you very well. It is very difficult, especially when you are recording outside with a lot of background noise. Okay?
well, all your easy runs now suddenly become tempo runs. All your interval runs are now becoming all-out max efforts. This ends up with you getting fatigued, you increase your risk of injury, and before you know it, you've blown up and you've got to start again. So
fatigue does not increase your risk of injury. Fatigue is the very thing that causes training to occur if it is imposed sensibly and appropriately using a well-designed program, which is not what it sounds like one would get from adhering to your advice at your little channel here. Okay?
So this is the one thing that you must never ever do. What we prescribe here at Coach Parry is that you've got to run where you are right now. So if you are a 3 hour 50 marathon runner, you train at those paces, and as you adapt the training and improve over time, you'll find yourself
another one who also needs to put his hands in his pockets or something when he's presenting,
eventually running 3 hour marathon pace.
One of the topical pieces of advice at the moment is to run fasted so that you can be fat adapted. Okay? I'm here to tell you that that is a limiter in performance. And
well, then you need to go back to school, son. You really do.
Also, it's just not physiologically sound advice.
Yes, it is, actually. For someone who is undertaking an appropriate program, it is absolutely a useful tool.
Because we have an unlimited supply of fat to use as energy when...
No, we don't. We just have a very, very large supply of fat to use for energy relative to, for example, carbohydrate.
We run, even in very lean individuals. So fat is your body's preferred fuel to use during long, moderate to low intensity exercise.
In fact, it is the preferred fuel for all levels of exercise up to and including the point of volitional exhaustion, actually. Your ideas here are probably based around the respiratory exchange ratio numbers that you will get from respiratory gas analysis on athletes during exercise. And unfortunately, they fail completely to take many things into account. And they give you a number which would suggest to you at the very, very high end of the RQ or RER range at sort of around about 1 and above up to about 1.15, that there is no fat being oxidized at that intensity. That is false. It is not true. And as such, actually, it's completely irrelevant anyway, because the reason that there is vastly more carbohydrate being oxidized for energy by the mitochondria at exercise intensities at that level is because vastly more carbohydrate is made available by way of the glycogenolysis occurring. Okay, it's pretty straightforward to understand. Clearly, though, you don't, by the sounds of things.
Exercise and training at the correct intensity.
Yes, there you go. Good, which is competitive and above at all times. Yes.
Is actually what's going to unlock your body's ability to be fat adapted and to use fat as its...
Oh my word. Now he thinks training intensity is the thing that unlocks fat adaptability. No, it isn't. No. Goodness me. Goodness me. This all comes back to what I was talking about earlier with this false idea that there are separate and disparate energy pathways and that the body has a choice which one it's going to use. No.
Preferred fuel. What is very important to understand is that the limiting...
Don't talk to us like we're morons, pal, because actually one of us is.
Energy substrate in your body is your carb storage in your muscles.
Right, that is training status dependent. Your resting muscle glycogen level is absolutely moderated most powerfully and most clearly cause and effect by your training status.
Muscle glycogen, as well as your body's ability to absorb and use carbohydrates on an ongoing basis. Okay, we use very small amounts of carbohydrates to access large amounts of fats. So on race day,
carbohydrates are not used to access fat at all. What are you talking about?
if we run out of those very small stores of carbohydrates that we've got in our bodies, that is what ultimately ends up limiting our performance.
We don't run out. The concentration of muscle glycogen drops very slightly, and that causes the power output of that muscle to be compromised. It is a self-protecting concentration, actually. Do you not even understand that?
We've got plenty of fat, but our body struggles to utilize it. In fat adapted.
No, it doesn't at all. What a load of rubbish. Our body does not struggle to use fat for energy.
Individuals, we can have free-floating ketones that can also do similar but not the same work that carbohydrates do. That also requires a breakdown of muscle, and by running in a fasted state.
Ketones do not require the breakdown of muscle, you absolute clown. Ketones require the breakdown of fat. My word. This is unbelievable, isn't it, chickens? Wow. This person claims to be an exercise physiologist. He knows nothing about exercise physiology, clearly.
State, you are accelerating the process of sarcopenia. So
absolute rubbish. Complete nonsense. Ketogenesis causes sarcopenia. No, it doesn't. False.
On the video on screen now if you want to learn a little bit more about sarcopenia.
I don't think we're going to learn much from you, son, frankly, except false disinformation.
Train at the right intensity.
Yes.
And you will be a fat-adapted athlete.
Yes. And the right intensity is whatever competitive intensity you wish to perform at for the period of time that you need to perform it over, or a shorter period of time at an intensity still higher than that. Okay? Always to exhaustion every time you train. No more than 3 or 4 times a week. No long, slow distance runs, no easy runs. Absolute contraindicated rubbish to be doing that. Don't do that. What's next?
And then we need to provide small amounts of carbohydrates, often throughout long endurance, moderate to low intensity exercise.
Never heard of gluconeogenesis then, clearly.
To get the best performance on race.
My Macca's Rewards gives you a little extra on your favourites.
Whoa. Free your inner foodie. Gurgin it.
Stay.
One piece of advice we hear quite often, and I actually refer to...
Goodness gracious me, a properly fat adapted athlete doesn't need to take in any food during an event. Why would they? There are hundreds of thousands of so-called calories of energy stored on, as you said yourself, even the leanest athlete. A well-adapted athlete is well and truly capable of producing all the glucose they need from that fat. What a load of rubbish. Okay, back to this clown again. What else have you got to say here, buddy?
To it as more of an old school mentality is don't walk. Walking is a weakness. Now, we here at Coach Perry really...
Walking is not training for running at all. If you need to walk, it is because you have exceeded your critical velocity for a period of time which has led you to volitional exhaustion. or you genuinely are psychologically weak. One of those two or both. The solution is to get back up to competitive intensity and to run yourself to exhaustion at that speed or faster, repetitively in your training, 3 times a week. What's next?
Really like to employ a walk strategy into most of our long training runs, and in
No, that's not a good strategy at all. Don't do that.
particular into your race day strategy. What happens, and the reason why we like to implement walking into the plan.
So, I mean, from what we can see in this video, it is absolutely clear and patent that the last thing that you ought to do is listen to anybody who's associated with this channel in terms of training for running. They simply don't have the first clue of what they're talking about at all. This is just the most appalling video about running I have ever seen. The worst ever.
Is when you are running, we often refer to running those easy runs easy enough, and walking is a really good way for you to force yourself to run and keep the intensity a little bit lower.
Rubbish. You don't want to keep the intensity lower, and you certainly don't want to be walking because that's not what you're training for. What's next?
Keep the intensity nice and easy. The other good advantage of walk breaks is also to make sure we're just reducing some of that eccentric loading on the legs.
No, in fact, what you need to be doing is to be training your legs to cope with the exact amount of eccentric loading that they do require during their event, and walking will not do that. Wrong again.
What do I mean by that? You get to a race, you start running, you go flat out as hard as you can, and you only walk when you feel you're forced into walking because your body's so tired, your legs are so sore. If you start employing that walk strategy much earlier on, from the beginning of a race, as part of your race strategy, it allows for a prolonged effort and sustained effort.
So does training at an appropriate intensity, the such like of which I have described, I think, quite adequately in this video. And again, what you're saying here backs up what I've been saying all along, which is, as you train, so shall you perform. And if you train to get tired and have to stop and walk, it's because your training intensity has been inappropriate. Probably for months and months and months, if not years, leading up to the event that we're talking about. That is why you should listen to someone who knows what they're talking about in training. And these 3 guys are not it. Not close. Nowhere close.
But throughout the race, meaning that race pace or that intensity can last a lot longer. You're not going to bomb out as much or as you might have if you were pushing yourself hard.
This is just rubbish. Absolute rubbish. There's no other way to describe this. There's no way to be polite about this. There's no way to soften this blow for people that think these guys are great. They are not. This is awful.
From the start without adding in a short walk break. When we talk walk breaks as well, it's not a case of taking a Sunday stroll and walk for a kilometer. We generally we work on a sliding scale, but typically if you're more novice, you would add a slightly longer walk break. If you're to the faster end or you've been running as a seasoned veteran for many years, a slightly shorter end, and also the frequency will depend on that sliding scale as well. But typically we look to about a 60 to 90 second walk break, and that walk break is also a brisk walk. It's not a Sunday stroll, as I mentioned. You're not going to lose too much pace in a brisk walk, and because it's so short, it really won't.
That's only true if your training intensity has been vastly below what it needs to be. Running and walking should be at vastly different velocities. Vastly. The mere fact that you're suggesting that they won't be that different shows me absolutely that you're training people to run far too slow. And that is a mistake. That is nonsense. That is rubbish from the start to the finish, which will be a lot further away because long and slow in training means long and slow on the day.
Won't have too much of an effect on your overall average pace that you might be chasing on race day.
So now that you've heard the worst running advice ever?
Yes, we have. We really have. I think we're done here, aren't we, boys and girls? That would be the end of any credibility this channel might have held. If you have any ability to be a bit rational and listen to someone who does know something about this, these three guys do not. Sorry about that. I would stop listening to these guys pretty much immediately in terms of how to train for running. Just full of errors from start to finish, full of advice that will only lead you to perform poorly and lead you to a higher likelihood of injury, certainly burn you out far sooner as an athlete than you should be burned out as an athlete, shorten your career as an athlete, and probably shorten your life as well, actually, because of the cardiovascular, the contraindicated nasty cardiovascular effects of vastly too much running volume over an extended number of years. Okay, there you go. There it is. Join me next time when someone else will be wrong on the interwebs, because it doesn't look like slowing down anytime soon, does it? No. See you then.